We're going to take questions at the end. We're making sure to save lots of time at the end of the session, so 15, 20 minutes to take Q&A. So we're going to go through the whole presentation before we take any questions, so please just hold them to the end. So my name is Michael Epping. I am a product manager in the customer experience team that's part of the Microsoft Entra product group at Microsoft, and I'm here with my colleague Mark.
Hello everybody, I'm Mark Morowczynski. I'm on the same team as Michael.
And today we are here to talk about Platform SSO, Microsoft's implementation of Platform SSO, and what sorts of things you should consider when you're trying to deploy it, what sort of best practices you might want to think about. We'll talk about some feedback that we're looking to get from customers, and then we'll leave you with some actionable items that you can go do in your own environment if you're going to start testing or actually start deploying any of the stuff that we talk about. We really like these sessions to be actionable. So we'll give you a lot of good technical detail, but at the end of the day, we want you to go use this stuff, so hopefully this helps you do that. So to set the stage a little bit, I just want to talk very briefly. This is going to be kind of an abridged history lesson. I'll probably miss some things that some people wish were in here. But from the perspective of identity on the macOS platform, there's been a couple different iterations. For a very long time, you always had the option to integrate Macs with some sort of on-premise oriented directory service. In a lot of environments, this meant Active Directory, although it wasn't exclusively for Active Directory. But a lot of enterprises already had Active Directory for their Windows fleet. This worked pretty well in a lot of cases until the era of remote work really started to pick up. Users were kind of in and out of the office more, laptops were becoming more common, and all of a sudden you don't have line of sight to domain controllers. This introduces all sorts of issues around how do my users sign in, how are credentials being cached, what happens if they're remote and can't see one of those domain controllers, when a password rotates or we force a password change on a user. All sorts of problems are introduced in our more modern world where most of our workforce can be remote at any given time. Apple did modernize their integration with on-prem oriented directory services that use Kerberos around 2019 with the introduction of the SSO framework and specifically the Kerberos SSO option. So this is basically just a native tool from Apple for, again, integrating primarily with an on-premise directory service. So if you have on-prem file shares, on-prem print servers, on-prem web servers, you can go get a Kerberos ticket from your domain controller, take that Kerberos ticket, present it to the resource, like your print server, and the user doesn't get challenged for username and password. So it's very good, but again, very on-prem oriented. At the same time, Apple released something called Enterprise SSO. So if you're in the previous session, this got discussed quite a bit. But Microsoft and a couple other vendors went and built support for this. Now, we didn't release our support in 2019. We went GA about 16, 17 months ago, but we were in public preview for a pretty long time. So customers did have a couple years to kick the tires on this. What Enterprise SSO allows you to do is get single sign-on for your cloud resources. So if you're using Microsoft Entra, and you are protecting applications with it and integrating applications into it. So this might be your Office 365 apps, but it also might be third-party apps like Salesforce, Workday, those types of things. Those are all applications that rely on tokens. So it might be an OIDC application that needs a JOT token or an Access token. It might be a SAML application that needs a SAML token. But what the Enterprise SSO extension helps you do is get those tokens on your Mac without needing to prompt the user all over the place. So if a user is signing into some application on their web browser and then they open Outlook or Teams or some other application in another browser tab, we're not just hammering them with login prompts. We can make this a nice, smooth, seamless experience. But it really does nothing for the local account management. We're really just extending this concept of single sign-on for cloud resources once the user has already signed into the device. There's also a pretty robust ecosystem of third-party services that kind of fill in some of the gaps that have existed on macOS. So we have our Jamf Connect type tools, our Xcreds, there's a couple other options out on the market. But basically, what these third-party tools allow you to do is kind of take this operating system that's very on-prem directory services oriented, if you want to have your users signing in with an enterprise credential, and kind of paper over the fact that you would prefer to be using a cloud IDP. So you can do something like synchronize the password between that local endpoint and your cloud IDP, like an Entra ID. However, what we really want to see from Apple is some sort of native capability in the platform that lets us move away from this on-prem directory services oriented configuration. And this is where Platform SSO comes in. So we'll go much deeper on this topic here in a minute. But this did come out in 2022. Microsoft has been working on this for quite a while. We did release our public preview a few months ago, I think in April or May. And we'll talk a little bit about how that works. So before I keep going, how many people here have deployed our enterprise SSO extension that went GA a while back? Okay, cool. So maybe a quarter of the room.
Yeah, about a third, a quarter, yeah.
Yeah. Before I keep going, everyone should deploy it if you use Entra ID. I cannot think of any great reasons. You can try to argue with me after. If you think that there's some reason you shouldn't deploy it, you will have a very hard time convincing me. So I would love to see many more hands next year if I ask the question again. So there's some gaps still. So obviously, none of the stuff that I outlined, other than talking about some of these third-party tools that fill in the gap, really provide a way to integrate with a native, or with a cloud provider natively. We're still very on-prem oriented. So in order to do identity management on our Macs, we need something like local credentials that are just managed, where the complexity and security of them is just managed by an MDM. We need these third-party tools, or we need an on-premise Active Directory. These on-prem dependencies continue to provide, or continue to cause worse and worse problems for many organizations. So for many organizations, like an increasing amount of the workforce is remote. We talk to a lot of customers that are starting to look to the future and think about getting rid of on-premise Active Directory. It's just not a tenable situation for them to keep joining these things and relying on an on-prem directory service in their environment. There's also a big proliferation of tools. In a lot of environments, you might need some combination of your third-party tool, the Kerberos SSO extension, the enterprise SSO extension. All of a sudden, you're deploying at least 3 tools in order to just manage identity on your Mac. And finally, we're very concerned about phishing resistance. So phishing is a pretty big problem in a lot of cloud ecosystems. And so we want to make sure that whatever we're building for the future can help improve the security posture of those customers who are using our platform. So Platform SSO is our strategy for this on Mac OS for solving some of these problems. So before I keep going, Platform SSO is not really a feature from Microsoft. It is a feature from Apple. It's a framework built into the operating system, which we are adding support for. So I want to be really clear about that. Our strategy is very much designed around using what Apple provides to us. So if you come up and you have some feedback or you've tested the public preview, there are sometimes things where we need to point you to Apple for feedback, to provide feedback, because there are certain things that are under their control, and then there are certain things that are under our control. But the basic idea with Platform SSO and this framework provided by Apple is it lets us take this pre-existing SSO extension framework that we've had for a while and extend it into local account management on the Macs. Fundamentally, this is a replacement for joining your Macs to an on-prem Active Directory or some other on-prem directory service. Apple actually allows us to go a bit further than what we could do with on-prem Active Directory, though, because we have options for multiple authentication methods. And I'll talk about what those are and some of the nuances of them in a little bit. So under the covers, what actually happens when you use Platform SSO? No matter what, in our implementation, the first step is a device registration. So we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts here. So in a device registration, basically what we do is we present the user with a screen, and I'll show a video of this so you can actually see it in action. We present the user with a screen where we have to have them authenticate. So we're going to require them to provide some sort of credentials that can be validated by our IDP, which is Entra ID in our case. If those credentials are correct and the IDP gives tokens back, we can basically use those tokens to continue our process. And what we do is we generate a device identity using the secure enclave of the Mac. We take that device identity, use it to create a device object in Entra ID, And then when that process is complete, we move on to step 2, which I'll cover in a second. But it's really important to understand this. If you are using Intune today, or if you're using a third-party MDM or a non-Microsoft MDM that is integrated with our third-party MDM compliance API, this is a change. So in the past, when we did device registration in our ecosystem, we would store the device identity in the keychain. We are no longer doing that. With Platform SSO, we are starting to hardware bind the device identity, meaning that it is no longer found in the keychain. This has some ramifications for some of your applications. So for example, if you have an application that needs to access the keychain, like Chrome is a classic example where if you use device-based conditional access, you are probably used to seeing pop-ups where the user is asked to consent to Chrome accessing some certificate in the keychain that's got this big long string of text that nobody really understands. The user has to click OK on that, otherwise they get blocked from signing in. That whole flow goes away. There is no more certificate in the keychain for something like Chrome to access. So if you have an application that needs to do device-based conditional access, it's going to need to know how to work in this new world where the device identity is being bound. Next, we go into a user registration step, and this is where the administrator has a choice. So again, step 1 that I just talked about, that happens no matter what. Device registration always occurs. The second step, where we do user registration, is where we basically, as the administrator, are choosing which type of credential are we going to have our users use. So in the Platform SSO framework, Apple has 3 different credential types, and our implementation supports all 3 of these. So the first one is password. This is good. It's better than nothing, but we'll talk more about why we maybe don't want to go with this option. But password basically does what it says it does. We keep the local account password in sync with Entra ID's password or a federated password. So if you are federating your Entra ID tenant to another IDP, like an on-prem ADFS farm, we can still support password. This actually uses the same protocols as Windows under the hood, which is good because if you already have Entra ID joined for your Windows devices working in your environment, you really shouldn't have to go do any additional steps. If you've never gotten Windows working in your environment, you may have a little work to do. But it uses the same protocol, where essentially the user provides a username and password, it gets checked against an IDP, and the IDP returns a response. We don't necessarily need to require MFA for registering this method, so that does make it useful for some scenarios where you may have users who don't have multi-factor as an option. But the downside from a security perspective is this does nothing for you for phishing resistance. You're really not moving the bar very much in terms of security. This is just a user convenience option. But we should be striving for more. We should be trying to up our game in terms of security as we roll these things out. I firmly believe that there are going to be customers who choose to deploy the password sync option today, and in a year or two, they'll be saying, whoops, we probably should have gone secure enclave, and they will be redeploying. So we'll talk more about the guidance for secure enclave key, but think long and hard about moving towards one of the best options here, which is secure enclave key, or if you have smart cards in your environment, the better option, the smart card option. So with the smart card option, same thing as before, this supports federation. In our ecosystem, we do require multi-factor authentication for this, which should not be a problem if you already have smart cards. It is phishing resistant, so this is a really good method. However, I really do not want to see customers go do new deployments of smart card infrastructure in order to support this. There's a lot that goes into supporting smart cards, like PKI and hardware and life cycle and figuring out what to do when users lose the smart card or the reader stops working. Don't go do a new deployment of smart card infrastructure to support this, but if you're like a gov agency that's already using them, this one's kind of a no-brainer. Most of the organizations out there we think should be using Secure Enclave Key. Secure Enclave Key is a phishing-resistant authentication method in our ecosystem, meaning if you have resources in your environment that you need to protect with phishing-resistant auth, like to get to your mailbox, to get to your ServiceNow environment, to get to your Salesforce environment, you can prevent those users from getting phished by using phishing-resistant credentials, and this is one of them. We actually use the same protocols as Windows Hello for Business here. So if you're familiar with Windows Hello for Business, this is our native phishing-resistant option on Windows. We are reusing the exact same protocols with a couple platform-specific nuances in this particular example. And I'll talk more about that in a second. This can also be used as a passkey. So if your user gets into a re-authentication scenario, they can use this secure enclave-backed credential to get back into the environment without having to fall back to a more phishable credential. And I'll show a video of that. So if you choose the password sync flow, we do go through step 2, user registration, and it's fairly straightforward. The user provides their username and password, so you'll see this little box pop up that says, please sign into your Microsoft Entra account. They have to provide their username and their password. We check that password using one of the protocols we talked about, and if everything's good, we return a response and a grant, and the local password is set by macOS, and we're done. They get the little notification saying, your password's synced, end of story. For secure enclave key flow, there's not too many more steps, but under the covers, there's quite a bit more happening from a security perspective. What we're going to have them do is authenticate locally, just proving presence on the device, and then we're going to then ask the secure enclave key, or the secure enclave, to generate a public key, private key pair. We send the public key to the IDP, and the private key never leaves the device. It is hardware bound to that Mac. This is very good because it means there is no credential traveling over the network that can be stolen. There's no credential that lives in the IDP that can be stolen. There is just a public key up there, and we'll show how that gets used in a second. On the Mac, you can actually query about status of this. So in the bottom right corner, you can see that there's some terminal output that shows the status of the device. That's from running the app-SSO platform command. And if you're running Sonoma or later, you can also see status in the GUI. So that's from the user and groups page in the settings app. So you can actually just check and see, is my user in a good state? So let's look at how the registration experience actually works for an end user who is using secure enclave key, which again is the experience we generally want customers to be standardizing on. So before I actually click play on this, you'll notice in the upper right corner there is a push notification or a little notification toast that says that registration is required. This is actually generated by macOS. Microsoft does not control this. The only thing we really get to do is we get to inject our icon in there and provide some basic control over the strings in the notification, like should it be in English, should it be in a different language, what should it say? But we really have very little control over this. We don't even control when it pops up. That is all controlled by macOS. So if you have a device where you're trying to test this stuff and the notification's not popping up, usually a good idea is just like reboot it and it'll usually pop back up. All right, so if I'm the user, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click on this notification. So I'll start the video here. So the user is going to just do that local authentication to prove that they're physically present in front of the device. And now we see an Entra ID login screen. In this case, I'm going to use a different passwordless credential, so a FIDO or a pass key that I have on my mobile phone in order to authenticate to Entra ID and establish this session. Some form of strong authentication is required here to do this registration for the secure enclave key. So it could be that I use passkey, could be push notification in Microsoft Authenticator, could be an SMS, etc. It flew through the device registration, it flew through the user registration, and then the very last step is that it informs the user that Company Portal can now be used as a passkey provider. There's one tricky thing here, which is we do have to show a little dialog box informing the user that they should go into the settings app and turn on Company Portal as a passkey option. There is no MDM control over that today. I don't remember hearing anything about Sequoia adding it, although I'm not 100% sure, but I know in Sonoma there is no way to go enable this. So the user has to actually take the action to follow that instruction. If that's going to be a problem for you, I would highly recommend talking to your Apple rep about it and making sure that feedback gets back to them. But at this point, the process is done. The user has completed both the device registration and the user registration. So under the covers, there were 2 separate steps that happened. But we don't really actually need to make the user do 2 different things. We can use the strong authentication tokens that we got from them signing in that screen to actually complete both steps. So pretty straightforward from an end user perspective. Now, if we actually want to authenticate using that secure enclave key, what we're basically going to do is use it as a FIDO credential, or we're going to do a WebAuthn flow. So I know there's an awful lot going on this screen, and I don't want to dive into all the details about how FIDO and WebAuthn work. It's probably out of scope for this. But the main thing to understand here is that when the user is authenticating, there is no credential that is passing over the network. So if an attacker is trying to phish this user, the user does not have a credential that they can give up that the attacker can actually use without that attacker also having physical access to their device. So this is a huge security improvement for most organizations because the vast majority of attacks we see out in the wild tend to come from phishing-based attacks, password spray attacks, things like that. So when the user authenticates here, basically what's going to happen is they are going to go to Entra ID and say, I would like some tokens. Entra ID will provide what's called a nonce, or just a random string of data. They will then authenticate locally to the secure enclave, sign that nonce using that private key that can never leave the device or be used off of the device, and that signed bit of random data is sent back to Entra ID, where it's validated using that public key that we created during the user registration step. If we validate it successfully, we know that it is the right user on the right device, and we can start giving them tokens. So now they can access their mailbox or their Salesforce or their Workday or whatever. So I know that last screen looked really complicated, but it's actually pretty simple from an end user experience perspective. So if my end user ends up in one of these re-authentication flows, they can end up in our FIDO key flow, click continue, scan their finger with Touch ID, which does the local authentication to the local secure enclave, and they're signed in. So we essentially just use the hardware of the Mac as a jumbo-sized FIDO key, rather than requiring external hardware. And this is a phishing-resistant authentication. So a couple nuances to call out. If you are not keeping your Macs up to date, it may be time to start thinking about Sonoma. macOS Ventura is the first version Apple released platform SSO into, but it had very rudimentary support for many of the options that customers are going to want. So it has some of the basic stuff like secure enclave key support, password sync support, and that's kind of it. There was no support for smart cards. There was very limited ability to report on like what's the state of the device. There's some add-on functionality like local account creation. Like if you have a Mac where you want multiple users to be able to use it, or you want admins to be able to authenticate on it using their Entra ID credentials without having to actually go create an entire local account, or you want to do Kerberos SSO, which we'll talk more about in a second. All of those options require Sonoma. So if you're going to play around with platform SSO, I would highly recommend updating to Sonoma. On the Kerberos item, so I talked earlier about how there's this big proliferation of tools that are required in order to do identity management on your Macs. With Platform SSO, we're going to start supporting this option where you can actually have Platform SSO and our tooling handle both the cloud single sign-on piece as well as that on-prem Kerberos single sign-on piece. This is going to reduce the number of tools that you need to deploy. So today, for customers who are using Platform SSO, if you also have on-prem resources, many of those customers are deploying the traditional Kerberos SSO extension side by side with Platform SSO. You're going to see a docs update from us, hopefully in the next couple weeks, as well as a new release of Company Portal that's going to start supporting this new option where you can have Platform SSO handle both pieces, the cloud SSO and the on-prem SSO. So you don't need to maintain this Kerberos SSO profile and make sure it's not stepping on the feet of your Platform SSO profile. So this is, again, going to help us simplify and hopefully get towards just one single tool for doing identity management on our Macs, or at least cut down the number of tools we need significantly. The user experience is very similar to the traditional Apple Kerberos SSO deployment, but it plays much nicer with the Platform SSO module. And then in addition to that, it also can provide SSO to Cloud Kerberos. So I don't know if anybody in this room necessarily would be using things like Azure File Shares, But as your file shares also support Kerberos tickets from Entra ID, this can support those as well, which has never been available on the Mac before. So there's a lot of benefit to moving to this new item. So again, when we get this doc out the door, we're going to start pushing customers to think about moving away from the older way to deploy Kerberos SSO on their Macs and move towards this new model. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mark to talk about some best practices.
All right, thanks, Michael. So I know that was a lot. We covered a lot of stuff. So if you needed like an extra sugar rush, there's still plenty of cake up there, upper right. But okay, so let's talk about some deployment best practices around platform SSO. And the first thing I'm going to start with here, if you didn't hear Michael say it enough, we're going to keep saying this, which is to deploy the secure enclave key method. I know for many of you in this room, you've been waiting a very, very long time to have the ability to do that password sync to the local Mac client built into the OS. But just stay with me for a few slides. I think you'll kind of see why you want to really go to that secure enclave method. So as Michael kind of alluded to, when you deploy the secure enclave method, you're getting a phishing-resistant MFA credential. I'll talk a little bit more about the phishing-resistant part and why that's really, really important on the next slide. This is considered to be an MFA credential because we're combining that something you have, right, which is the device with the secure enclave, and then that knowledge factor, that's something that you know, that your local password, local passcode, or local PIN, depending on how you want to think about it. If the user signs in with their Touch ID, again, that's going to be considered to be multi-factor because we're combining the something you have, that device, with the something that you are, that biometric, right, the fingerprint sensor. And this is really important because this will allow you, when you get a primary refresh token, or the PRT, and we actually covered how the PRT works and all that kind of stuff 2 years ago when we were here at Mac Admins. But when you get that, it will show that you have done strong authentication on sign-in. And this will allow you to satisfy any of your conditional access policies that require MFA automatically. And we see this question come up in the Mac Admin Slack, in the LinkedIn Mac Admins group. They say, hey, I've deployed the password sync method, and now when my users sign in, they're getting prompted when they open Outlook, because that's talking to Exchange Online, or they click on Teams, and they're getting prompted, or Workday or Salesforce, or whatever the application is that's in conditional access, that's in scope, and I'm getting prompted. But when I move to the secure enclave method, they don't. Right? That's expected, because the primary refresh token indicates that they've done strong authentication on sign-in. And this is really, really what we want. Right? We want to have those good security controls in place, but we don't want to be over-prompting those users. That teaches people to give up their credentials frequently. We don't want to do that. We only want to prompt them when it's truly, truly necessary. Now, I said this is a phishing-resistant credential, and this is becoming more and more important. There's a really great quote that's attributed to Bruce Schneier. If anyone knows who Bruce Schneier is, he's a well-known security expert. But it's actually not him. He said he heard this from the NSA. And the quote is, attacks only get better, they never get worse. Right? And that's very, very true. Our defenses are going to be eroding over time. The security controls we put in place 2 years ago, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago are not going to stand up to some of the more modern day attacks. Okay? Today, the absolute bare minimum is MFA. If you have not deployed MFA in your organization, you are behind. When you get back on Monday, that needs to be the first thing that you do. It's super, super important. You have to be at least at MFA. But because so many organizations are already at MFA, we're starting to see attackers focus their attacks against MFA. And one of those types of attacks is this adversary in the middle, phishing proxy type of attack. This image is taken from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. This comes out typically in the fall. It's a free download. It has this, a bunch of other stuff in there. Take a look at it. But basically how this works is the attacker will have this phishing site or a proxy site in the middle. There's tools that do this, like if anyone's heard of Evil Jinx, or older than that was called Malishka. And basically how it works is it kind of sits in the middle between whatever the user and whatever site they're trying to phish their credentials for. So in this case, we'll say on the right there, the target website is Entra ID. And the site will look just like your login page because they're just mirroring that page to the user. So then they send some link to the user, they get it to them some way, right, some email, whatever. Get the user to click on it, come to their page. It looks just like the sign-in page they're used to seeing. They put in that username and password. The attacker takes that, plays it against Entra ID. Entra ID says, looks good. Please complete this MFA challenge response. It sends it back to that proxy server, which is the attacker. The attacker takes that, shows it to the end user. The end user's like, yep, this is what my stuff normally looks like. They do the MFA challenge response and send it back to the proxy. The proxy takes that, plays it against Entra ID. Everyone says, yep, that looks good. Here is your cookie or token or whatever it is. And then the attacker now has that sign in for that user. They redirect the user off to some other error page, whatever they want to do with that. Okay? So we're starting to see these different types of attacks. And this is why people are starting to move to those phishing-resistant credentials. This is going to be those FIDO2 credentials, also known as a passkey. If you went to Joe's session yesterday, that was really good. He kind of covered how this stuff works. But you're going to want to start to understand how do these things work with that WebAuthn and CTAP2 protocol? And Michael mentioned we could spend like a whole day or a whole hour going into the weeds on that stuff. We actually have a really good video about this. So you can take a look at this, and it kind of covers how does it work under the covers. He kind of hit the high points, right? You have a public, you have a private key, there's a nonce, there's some stuff like that in there, but this kind of covers how that all works. But once you do that registration here, you get that passkey. And this is becoming even more important for many organizations. Because as Michael mentioned, they're saying in order to get to these resources, you have to come from a phishing-resistant credential. It's that important. And they're going to do that using something called conditional access authentication strengths. And at the end here, we want to get the Mac admins community's feedback about how they would like to see the secure enclave represented in that. You can do it today, but we can make some changes. We want to get your feedback at the very end. But the other thing that we see is once people start to roll out these phishing-resistant credentials, the attackers, again, change their tactics. And they focus on the endpoint. Okay? They try to get malware on the endpoint. They need to do some sort of token theft of that endpoint, right? Look for apps that haven't been updated they can take advantage of, right? They start focusing on that endpoint to try to steal those tokens because they can no longer grab the tokens in the middle and do that phishing type of attack. So if you haven't deployed PSSO yet, please do it with Secure Enclave. You're going to have to do this eventually. MFA will not be good enough forever. You're going to have to do this, and as Michael mentioned, if you do it now with password sync, in a year or 2 years from now, you have to roll out Secure Enclave. You're going to have to make your users re-register. So just jump to the end, do Secure Enclave. You'll get a better end user experience because they won't get prompted for those MFA prompts. And then you can turn your attention to focusing on where the attackers are going to go next, which is the endpoint. And spend that time hardening the endpoint and continue to focus on that because that's where they're going to go take care of this issue. So go with the Secure Enclave if you haven't deployed it. Okay? The second thing, regardless if you pick password sync or Secure Enclave, you're going to need to align your local password management of your MDMs for macOS for Platform SSO. If they're out of line, you can get some conflicts, and it either ends up like they can never complete the registration or they get into a bad end user experience. So we'll start with Secure Enclave. If you have a local MDM password policy that has overly complex password rotation requirements, things like that, so if you're making your people set their passwords every quarter, they will fall into these very predictable patterns. So if you say every quarter, someone's going to have their password as summer 2024 what? Exclamation point. Is that going to be at the front or the end? Always at the end, right? So they start to fall into these very predictable patterns. The other issue they might do is if they'll write it down, right? They put on the sticky note, they put it next to their desk, they put it on the device. That's no good either, right? So we've got to make sure we have that right balance of what we're going to do for this and the protection of that. From a password sync perspective, if your password policies are more complex or they're not aligned to what you're doing either in Entra ID or Active Directory, depending on what your source of authority is, you might find that users can actually complete the registration process. And we see this come up all the time in the Mac admin Slack, as well as the LinkedIn Mac admins group. I actually saw one this morning today. They said, hey, I did the rotation and all the stuff. It won't let me set the local password. Yep, because you're out of sync and you won't be able to meet the requirements. So we gotta make sure that's in sync. So let's talk about what we could do for that. From a secure enclave perspective, you want to align the local passcode, the local password, the local PIN, however you want to think about it, to what you're doing with your other devices in your organization. What is the local passcode requirement you have today for your iPhones? What is the local passcode requirement you have for your iPads? If you've rolled out Windows Hello for Business, this is called the PIN. What is the actual PIN requirements you have set in your organization? Okay? So we recommend to, in the Windows Hello for Business side, at a minimum of 6 to 8 characters, allowing biometric is allowed, and then we're going to start to fall back to the built-in anti-hammering techniques that these different platforms have, right? So if somebody was to grab your iPhone off the table and run out there and try to guess your passcode, right? Like they only do so many attempts before it starts to kind of push them back and delay them, right? So macOS has the same thing, so we're going to align to that. Here's where you'll set this. This is what it looks like on the Intune side. This is in the DDM section for passcode. You can see we have it set for, it's a little hard to see, but it's 6 is the minimum, and we're allowing biometric. From a password sync guidance, we recommend you remove the MDM password policies altogether and just let this be driven from Platform SSO. This will be getting the password policy from Entra ID, again, or Active Directory, depending on what your source of authority is. If anyone wants to get into that, we can talk about that more afterwards. But if you do have to keep a local password policy for some reason via the MDM, you have to make sure at a minimum that it's the same. Otherwise, you will not be able to set the stuff. This is not a new problem. Okay, if anyone that's dealt with multiple identity providers on-prem, Active Directory, LDAP, mainframe, whatever, and you're trying to have that illusion of single sign-on, right, where you have the same password on all the different systems and the user doesn't know the difference, they just put the same thing in, then as soon as one has a more hard requirement than the other, that password can't be set on that device, and then they kind of get all out of whack. You're going to run into the same thing here, okay? So at a minimum, make sure you're aligned if you're doing this policy. Okay, enabling recommended MDM configuration settings. So all the configuration options that you have enabled in Enterprise SSO, you can move those over. Be careful when you're doing this. You don't want to have two profiles with conflicting settings, an Enterprise SSO profile and a Platform SSO profile with conflicting settings. You'll get to errors. So what we recommend is to do this. You create your new Platform SSO profile. You take your users that are in your Enterprise SSO profile, you remove them from scope, and then you put them into the Platform SSO profile. Okay? So that's how you're going to move those users over, and then you can get rid of the Enterprise SSO profile and just use the Platform SSO profile. From a settings perspective, please start with the recommended and documented Platform SSO settings, especially things like shared device keys. Okay? So shared device keys is going to be a requirement in many of the Sonoma features, like having multiple users be able to sign in. So we have that in the recommended settings. If you kind of just go on your own and set your own settings and you realize, oh, I need that, I want to have that functionality, and you rolled it out without it, your users are going to have to re-register again. Okay? So start with this, then start to iterate from there on the changes that you want to make. We had a customer a few weeks ago that had been trying to get Platform SSO to work for about a week, and Michael joined the call, and they had skipped like a whole bunch of these recommended settings. As soon as we turned that on, everything started working as expected, and then they started to change from there. So start with the baseline, it's all in our docs, then make your iteration changes from there. Deploy the Kerberos settings as part of what Michael just talked about, as part of the Platform SSO configuration, and move all the apps over that you have configured in your Enterprise SSO settings so you can get that single sign-on experience. So if you have it configured, so like your VPN, if you're at the previous session, Sean showed how he does that in his environment. You have Adobe or whatever it happens to be, you can get that single sign-on. And we're getting to a really, really good state here for our users, because you can have that user sign in with a strong credential, that secure enclave method. They're going to get single sign-on to all their cloud resources. They'll be able to get the curb TGTs for the on-prem resources, and they'll really get single sign-on across all our stuff. This is a really, really good experience. And then lastly, on that MDM password policy, talk to your security teams, talk to your identity teams. You want to be aligned with what they're doing across the different devices. You don't want to go rogue and make your own kind of password policy for this and just kind of go make this your own thing. Like, you want to align with what you're doing with your rest of your devices. Okay? Understanding the impact of that hardware-bound device identity. Michael kind of alluded to that, but we'll kind of dig in a little bit deeper. So as he mentioned, there's no access to that device key material. It's all controlled by the Platform SSO broker in the secure enclave. So if you have an application that is broker aware, so this is going to be like the Microsoft apps like Outlook, or if you have a line of business app and you're using the Microsoft authentication libraries for Objective-C or Swift, those will continue to work as expected. If you have an application that is not broker aware, but it's calling the web system APIs, this thing like Safari, that will continue to work as expected, right? So these are probably the apps that you're getting single sign-on for. If you have an application that is not broker aware and it's not calling the system APIs and it's calling its own thing, this is most notably Firefox and Chrome do this, right? You're not getting single sign-on for these apps probably today. Those you may run into an issue. Michael kind of mentioned it with the device-based conditional access stuff. So basically, the app vendor needs to take a change and understand how to talk to that broker, or the Platform SSO provider, in this case Microsoft, needs to do something special for some of those applications, and we did that for Chrome. So there's a Chrome extension you can install for your Mac. It's the same Chrome extension you install for Windows. It has the same extension ID, and this will get you two big things. The first thing it'll get you is you will get single sign-on with Chrome, just like you get with Edge and Safari. I know this has been one of the biggest kind of complaints and issues from the Mac admin community, so you install this extension, you'll get single sign-on now for Chrome. The second thing is the thing that Michael kind of mentioned. So if you remember that like workplace join key access that Chrome asks for, and you have to kind of put in a password and no one understands what they're doing, they just kind of just throw it in there, that will no longer appear. You'll be able to pass those device-based conditional access policies with Chrome just like you can today with Safari and Edge. Okay? Now, this also applies to MDMs. So when we rolled this out, we said, hey, make sure you talk to your MDM vendor to make sure that they support this, because if they don't, you're going to break that device-based conditional access, and we don't want to do that. So if your MDM client is reaching into the keychain to pull some sort of device ID information out, again, it's not there, it's in the secure enclave, so that's not going to work, so it won't be able to report back whatever it is it's doing to the MDM server to set the compliance. And we don't want to do this, right? We don't want to break that. Device compliance is a super important security control. We want to make sure we're continuing to do that. So what they'll have to do is very similar to what the applications will have to do, is they will have to update their MDM client to know how to talk to the platform SSO broker so they can grab whatever the device information that they're looking to get, device ID, whatever that happens to be, and then report that back over to the MDM server, and then again, continue to set that compliance, okay? So make sure you talk to your MDM vendors and make sure that they're aware of this and they should have a plan for this. All right, next, follow Apple's TLS guidance. So if you're doing any breaking and inspecting on these two specific URLs, this will break all of the SSO stuff that we do on the enterprise SSO side as well as the platform SSO side. This is the #1 support case we get about enterprise SSO, is that the break and inspect is happening. So work with your networking teams, make sure they allow these two URLs at a minimum, but you probably want them to enable for the entire wildcard, because I'm sure there's other functionality that's getting broken as part of that.
MAC evaluation utility.
Just wait, okay? So what we see is that we tell them, hey, talk to your networking team, and the networking team says, no, we're not doing that. Everything looks good. And they go, okay, say they're not doing it. I recheck my profile. I'm using the recommended default settings. This thing still does not work. What's going on? And this is where we're going to go into the trust but verify part of troubleshooting, and we're going to use the MAC evaluation utility that you can get from Appleseed. I was very pleased to see this was talked about in multiple sessions this week. I thought this was kind of like a hidden gem, but y'all are too smart for that. You're on top of that. But this is great. It shows you if there's any break and inspect happening, and you can use that and take that to your networking team. If you don't have access to this because you're not part of Appleseed for IT for whatever reason, you can also pull this out of the logs if you run the sysdiagnose command and search for com.apple.app SSO, and then you can take this. But use this, take this back to your networking team, and say, hey, I know you said you're not doing it, but the Apple utility says you are. Can you help us take a look? And then usually what happens, they're like, let me look. Oh, yeah, there was the other policy that I forgot to check, and now it should be working, right? So take a look at that. All right, last one for me here on best practices is to use the troubleshooting guides. So we see repeatedly in the Mac Admin Slack and the LinkedIn Mac Admins group, PSSO isn't working. Has anyone seen this before? The answer to that is yes. I just talked about several ways how PSSO could not be working. The question that they're really asking, though, is, have you seen my specific issue before? And the answer to that question is maybe. Okay? So we have two troubleshooting guides. The Enterprise SSO Troubleshooting Guide, if you haven't looked at it yet, it's very detailed and verbose. It's very long. It walks you through a whole bunch of stuff in there about how you can look at the logs, figure out what's going on. You can start with that. Like if you're getting started, because about 2/3 of them hadn't deployed Enterprise SSO yet, start with that and follow that guide that will really walk you through what's going on. Then we also have one for the Platform SSO, which is more specific to some of the things like, it will help answer the questions like, hey, does anyone know why Chrome doesn't work anymore? Or, hey, does anyone know why I can't set my password anymore, right? So that's covered in there. Okay, so take a look at that. If you do need help and you're going to post, we ask please be as specific as possible. What is the credential you're using? Is it password, smart card, or hopefully secure enclave? Which OS are you on? Ventura, Sonoma, or when the time is right, Sequoia? I spent a lot of time with somebody trying to get the multiple user login stuff to work, and we're tearing everything apart and we're trying to get it to go. And I'm like, okay, I think we got a bug. What is the version of Sonoma that you're on? And they're like, nope, Ventura. And I'm like, well, let's refer to Michael's slide, and you can see there's a big red box there because that's not supported in that OS. That's on me, I should ask that at the beginning, but that stuff really helps us kind of shortcut some of these kind of troubleshooting questions. What is your MDM, and does your MDM support this? We'll try to be as helpful as possible regardless of the MDM. If you're having issue with Intune and Entra ID, that's really easy for us to troubleshoot because those people sit across the hall from us and we can go talk to them, but that's really helpful. I know people are very excited about Platform SSO. I've seen some crazy configurations that have been putting in the Slack and things like that nature. Just make sure whatever you're doing is supported by your MDM. You might have gone a little too far off the path. Where did you differ your configuration from the recommended config, and where did the troubleshooting guides lead you to believe where the issue is? Again, the recommended config, that helps us understand maybe where you're at, where you got to, and we can give you some more specific guidance on oh, okay, you think it's in this area and you did this, maybe take a look at this setting and things like that. So this is very helpful for us. And then lastly here, do you have a support case open? I get it. We're all in IT. Nobody wants to call the help desk. I totally get it. But it's really important. First of all, it helps make sure the right logs are getting collected to really help troubleshoot the issue. The second thing is Michael and I and the few other people that help respond to things in the Mac Admin Slack and the LinkedIn Mac Admins group, we do that in between meetings and when we can, waiting for the bus to arrive and stuff like that. The support org has a whole other animal of machinery that has account team members and escalation paths and all that kind of good stuff that will help you with that. And the other thing is this helps us get the data we need to determine, like, is this a widespread issue, or is this like unique? Are you the first person to find this issue? Is this going to be a big problem? And that's really helpful versus just like, this is what Michael and Mark think we should go fix next. Is like, this gives us the data. And that's where we learned that the Apple TLS stuff is the #1 cause. Right? That's the #1 cause. So we spend more time updating our docs to kind of call that out, talking about different things. So please open the support cases. I know it's a pain in the butt sometimes, but it's really, really helpful for the data. And with that, I want to turn it back over to Michael to talk about some of the authentication strings feedback.
Thanks, Mark. So we're going to do some live feedback on some of the platform SSO stuff that we're thinking about. So I'm going to run you through this, and I know we may be more of a device admin than identity admin audience here. So I'll try to explain this as best I can, and hopefully we can get your perspective on this very identity-centric question. So as we are working on our platform SSO public preview, one of the things that we need to figure out is what are the requirements that we're going to enforce internally in order to go to general availability. So as we mentioned earlier, it's really, really important to us at Microsoft that the macOS Secure Enclave key is treated appropriately in our ecosystem as a phishing-resistant credential. So today, what you may see on the screen here is an authentication strength policy. So in conditional access, if I want to, say, require phishing-resistant auth to get to Exchange Online, to get to your mailbox, you will create a policy, and it will probably use this built-in phishing-resistant authentication strength that we have pre-built in every tenant. And it will list, you can do Windows Hello for Business, or a passkey, or CERT-based authentication with a multi-factor CERT in order to get to that resource, which would be your mailbox in this case. So today, in the public preview, macOS Secure Enclave key is actually included in that Windows Hello for Business bucket. So what we could do, which would be fairly quick if we can get the appropriate buy-in and we get the feedback that this is the right direction to go, is we could just update this string in the portal here to say it's Windows Hello for Business and Secure Enclave key. The downside here is we lose granularity between Windows and macOS. So this would basically overload this control, and it wouldn't let you say create a policy where you could say Windows Hello for Business is acceptable, but Secure Enclave key is not, or vice versa, a policy where you could say Secure Enclave key is acceptable, but Windows Hello for Business is not. So you wouldn't have that per OS granularity in an easy and understandable way. The other option is we could break them out into two separate controls. We could update all of our policies and our APIs and all of our internal frameworks so that macOS Secure Enclave key is its own dedicated control. And what you would see in the built-in policy is this big set of OR statements. But if you were to create a custom policy, you would have that per OS granularity to say macOS Secure Enclave key is acceptable to get to this resource and Windows Hello for Business is not, or vice versa. So this is better because it gives you that flexibility and per OS control, but the downside is this may significantly extend how long it would take us to get to general availability. So the question for the audience is, one, do you have a preference? So I'm going to do just raise of hands here. So does anybody have a preference for less granularity but faster GA? Raise of hands. Okay, I got a couple.
Can you define significantly longer time?
That's a great question. So the question for the recording is, can I define significantly longer time? The answer is it is completely indeterminate at this point. We do not know how long it would take, but let's say it's not going to happen this calendar year if we go with option 2.
Welcome to being a product manager.
Yeah.
I saw some people in the front row kind of like, oh, yeah.
That is a great. So the question was, would there be an option, or is it an option for Microsoft to do option number 1, the fast GA option, and then later do option number 2? It's within the realm of possibility. We would have to do the appropriate resourcing and all that, but it doesn't, doing option 1 does not stop us from later doing option 2.
Throw this back to Rich. Hand it back.
Two for two. Nothing but rich.
So this may be, different people are going to have different answers, and I think my answer is going to be based on the current size of the fleet that I'm supporting, which is about 41,000 endpoints.
Yep.
I am more inclined towards option 2, though it takes a little longer because it will be more future-proof, and that means that I can roll it out as part of, say, the development cycle for a new OS, and then I don't have to worry about rejiggering it for the next year. When you're deploying to 41,000 endpoints, 50,000, 100,000, that's you're definitely more on the side of conservatism as opposed to, oh, I've got 100 endpoints and, if they break, maybe I can visit them.
Right.
Okay. We have a question up front.
Whoa.
Next row back, please.
As someone who's already living the PIV card life, would there be a second and a half or third? Are these all mutually exclusive?
If you are living the PIV card life, you're already,
We're already
in the certificate
certificate-based,
bucket,
but
so
I could see some advantages as we introduce Max to going with the secure enclave. So would there be a way to do this as everything's not mutually exclusive, like cert and is rather than or?
you want to do cert and what?
Like the secure enclave key.
I see. Not today, but that's
Okay.
good feedback.
Yeah, because convincing my security people to keep what we have and then add in that option as they get comfortable with it would be way easier than go, well, we got to do one or the other and one's more secure, but it requires something completely different than what we're doing now. That's kind of a harder argument.
Okay,
It's good feedback for all the smart card folks.
cool. Next row.
So if you go with option 2, do you anticipate that the longer preview will be less stable as you go through this transition?
No, so today, if you're using the preview, it already looks like option 1. It's just, we could say this is acceptable, and we're going to go to general availability. And if we do option 2, the only real difference from a preview perspective is at the end of the preview, when we get to general availability, you'll have more flexibility. But if you want to test today, it already looks like this. It's just that this little red dialogue in the UX is not there.
Right. I was more speaking to like if you're going to create a whole new API infrastructure to separate these things out, at some point you're going to have to cut over. Is that going to induce any more risk?
No. So if you deploy, so for anybody who's not aware, features that are in public preview for Entra are publicly supported. So if it's in public preview, you can deploy it with support, and that means that we have certain obligations when we make updates to it. We don't intend to do any breaking changes when we split it to the second option. Like that's all back-end server-side stuff for us. So if you deploy platform SSO today in this format, and later we split it to look like this, that's not intended to be a breaking change where you need to go do something on your end, unless you want to update your policies to take advantage of the new option. So your users should not have to re-register. Hopefully that's clear.
So let's take a vote. Let's do one more vote, and then we'll close it out and do Q&A. So how many want option 1? Okay, same, like maybe 10 people. How many people want option 2? Oh my goodness. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Your feedback's super helpful.
No, it's awesome.
We definitely take this stuff into account. So we will take this back to the team in Redmond, and we will use this as evidence for what customers are telling us they need. So with that, we are going to wrap up with some go-dos. So a couple things just to reiterate. Hopefully this helped you understand how Platform SSO works and some of the prerequisites. So if you don't remember anything else, remember that we said secure enclave key, secure enclave key, secure enclave key, and update to Sonoma. So deploy that secure enclave key. Think about how you're going to manage that local memorized secret on the Mac to align more with the way that you're doing this on other devices where you may be moving towards phishing-resistant credentials. Make sure you understand these hardware-bound device impacts. If you use Chrome, deploy the extension. If you use a non-Microsoft MDM, that has a dependency on the keychain, make sure you talk to your MDM vendor. Use those conditional access authentication strengths that we just talked about, and hopefully provided a little context on what we're thinking about doing with those. And then continue to provide feedback to us. So the feedback is super helpful as we're in these preview stages, but it's super helpful for Apple as well. Like, we provide feedback to Apple, but we can really tell that customer feedback carries weight with them more than just hearing it from Microsoft. And if you have MDM providers that you want to make sure that they're supporting this stuff, or you're in a good state to use it, talk with them as well, or send them our way. We're happy to chat with them as well if we need to have a Microsoft to MDM conversation. We do try to watch all of the public channels, like we're in the Microsoft Entra channel, primarily on Mac Admin Slack. There's the LinkedIn Mac Admins group that we keep an eye on. We try to be active in these places because we know that the community is out there. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Mark or myself, and we'll try to get you the answers if we can. With that, we will open it up
And we
to
have a question in the back if you want to. Let's do Rich, and then go to you, and then we'll work our way around.
I was like, that's
So my shop is using Jamf Pro for its device compliance.
Yeah.
One of the things we're able to do now is pull information out of various functionality to say whether or not you're enrolled in device compliance and things like that. When this moves over into Secure Enclave, our concern is that we're going to stop being able to read that stuff because, you know, things check in, but they don't check out. Is there any planned functionality where we'll be at least able to query a tool and find out what's in the Secure Enclave in terms of, am I enrolled in device compliance? Is everything working?
You'll be able to, so there's a couple different angles to it. So Apple, what I would look for first is, does the app SSO platform command provide the information that's needed in order to understand the state of the device? So that's Apple's utility for understanding, like, did the device registration complete? And is there a device ID? Did the user registration complete? What type of credential is the user registered for? Or am I in a bad state? I would rely on the platform utility first. If you're looking for some Microsoft-specific information that might not be surfaced by that tool, it's something where you need to call into the broker. So, for example, like with the third-party MDMs, the change that they need to make in order to keep things like third-party compliance integration working is they need to know the Microsoft ID of the device. They have to call the broker to get that information, because the broker now is in control of anything device ID related, because there's no more certificate in the keychain. You could do something similar with an application on the device where you could potentially use like our auth library or the Apple System Web APIs to call the broker and get some Microsoft specific information. But if you try that out and there's something missing, we're happy to take that feedback back to the developers and say, like, can we add XYZ API?
All right, send it back that way.
All right, I'm
and
going
we'll
to try to
make
check.
our way to Sean. No. Oh, there you go.
Not a question, just a comment that if you are providing feedback to Microsoft and Apple, do that simultaneously. If you have an Apple Care support agreement, they will have a cooperative arrangement with Microsoft so that that circle is closed. Do all the things all the time.
Thank you. Sean.
I have been told by a little birdie that if you are using Jamf Pro and you are using device compliance for Microsoft, number one, absolutely under no circumstances deploy it to production using 11.7 of Jamf Pro. However, you are highly encouraged to join a certain beta coming soon. You did not hear this from me. Join the beta program. Thank
Thank
you.
Birdie.
I'm not being recorded at all. We should all be on the beta program.
Right off the melon on that one.
How do you see this being used in like education where you have highly shared computers?
Yeah, so this topic does come up a lot around different like user personas in an environment. The first thing I would say is for any of your situations where they are not shared computers, like administrators or teachers if they have individual machines, you should probably be following the general like knowledge worker guidance we provide around Secure Enclave Key. For things like computer labs for students, where you may have different students coming in throughout the day, That's one where I am amenable to the argument that password sync is probably the right option, because generally students don't have a multi-factor authentication factor. Ideally, hopefully, they don't have phones, although these days that's probably questionable. But it's pretty common to want to have a setup where any random student can come in throughout the day, sit at the machine, type in their password, sign into it. The password sync option is really good for that. There is the limitation today that Sean mentioned in the last session, where generally an administrator is going to need to set up the device first in the computer lab, and then going forward, any random student can come in and sign into it.
So we do have MFA enforced for everybody. So there's that.
Okay. If you have MFA enforced for everybody, including the students, you could deploy the secure enclave key method. The ramification will be that that student will have to use their MFA method in order to bootstrap that passkey, basically. But then going forward, if they ever use that computer again, they can do the Touch ID passkey flow.
Okay. So then you do allow both methods simultaneously, like in an environment?
So it's a good question. So if you deploy the secure enclave key method and you're on Sonoma and you have it set up to support multiple user logins, if a user has never sat down at the device before, like I'm a new student and I sit down at the computer, I can use my Entra ID, user principal name, and password to do the initial account creation. And then the moment I hit the desktop, it's going to ask that user to register for the secure enclave key. Other questions?
There's still cake up here. I'm surprised. I figured you all would be grazing on it.
Okay. If nothing else, then
All right.
thank you, everyone.
Well,